I was on my way to the meeting about my husband's inheritance. My Richard had passed 6 months ago, and the quiet in our house, once a comfort, now felt like a heavy, suffocating blanket. The world had moved on, but I was still standing in the same spot, trying to put one foot in front of the other. I put on the emerald green dress he had loved, the one that made me feel strong even when my heart was crumbling, just a few weeks ago. I'd been so full of hope, so sure that after the meeting, I could finally begin a new chapter. I had a feeling this would be the final time I had to deal with the lawyers and the estate, and I was looking forward to moving on. But as I got into my car, a man I'd seen sleeping on the park bench for weeks shuffled towards me, his face a roadmap of silent suffering. He didn't say a word, just slid a single faded black and white photograph under my windshield wiper, then turned and walked away. It was a picture of my husband and me, taken on our honeymoon in Italy, but in his pocket. I saw the corner of an official-looking document with a signature on it. Before I dive into my story, I'd really appreciate it if you could let me know where you're watching from in the comments, and if you'd consider subscribing to my channel. It would mean the world to me and help me keep sharing more stories like this. Thank you so much for being here. Eleanor had spent the last 40 years building a life centered on love and stability, and now found herself navigating a world that had suddenly become foreign. 6 months had passed since her husband Richard's death, and with each day, the quiet of their grand old home became less about peace and more about a deafening void. The legal meeting about his inheritance was scheduled for that afternoon, an event she'd been dreading and longing for in equal measure. She chose a simple, elegant black dress, a stark contrast to the vibrant colors she had always preferred. It was a choice that felt less like mourning and more like armor for the battle she instinctively knew was ahead. The autumn air, usually a welcome crispness, felt heavy as she stepped outside, the weight of the past 6 months settling on her shoulders. Her car, a familiar comfort, was a momentary escape, but as she reached for the door handle, a figure shuffled into her path. It was a man she had seen countless times on the park bench, his face a roadmap of hardship and a profound sadness. He didn't speak a word, only held up a small, weathered USB drive. His eyes, a shockingly clear shade of blue, locked with hers as he said, "He told me to give this to you, ma'am. He knew they would try to erase his last words." The words, so out of place from a stranger, sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. It was a warning, a gift, and a mystery all wrapped into one. And it felt like a tiny crack in the suffocating reality she had been forced to accept. The drive to the lawyer's office was a blur of confusion and dread. The tiny USB drive felt impossibly heavy in her trembling hand, a small beacon of hope in the suffocating darkness of her grief. Inside the sterile meeting room, her son Daniel and his wife, Sarah, were already there, their faces a mixture of forced sympathy and barely concealed impatience. The air was thick with a silence that screamed of unspoken intentions. Eleanor watched as the young, slick lawyer, Mr. Finch, cleared his throat and began to read from a new, leather-bound will. A document, he explained, was the most recent version found in a safety deposit box her husband had supposedly rented just a week before his passing. The document stated that Sarah was to take full control of all of Richard's business assets, and the family's foundation, a legacy he had spent his entire life building, while Eleanor would be left with the house and a small, fixed income. A cold numbness spread through her veins, not from the loss of control, but from the insidious lie that her Richard had ever doubted her. She forced her expression to remain neutral, her gaze fixed on her daughter-in-law, Sarah, a single, practiced tear rolling down her cheek, reached for her hand and whispered, "Mom, I'm so sorry. I know Dad always said he wanted someone with a sharp business mind to handle his legacy." The words were a dagger to her heart. Eleanor looked at her son, his gaze fixed on the floor, and saw a fleeting expression of guilt cross his face before he quickly looked away, but not before she caught a glimpse of the single tear he quickly wiped away from his cheek. That single tear told her everything she needed to know. He was a victim of his wife's manipulations, a pawn in a game he didn't even understand. The thought gave her a flicker of strength she hadn't known she possessed. I returned home, the quiet house now feeling like a fortress of lies and betrayal. And instead of confronting them, I simply went to my study. I placed the USB drive into my laptop, my hands trembling as I waited for the screen to flicker to life. A short video file appeared with the simple title, "For Eleanor." My husband's face, so full of love and worry, filled the screen, and I felt a fresh wave of grief wash over me. He began to speak, his voice calm and clear, explaining that he had known his greedy daughter-in-law would try to forge a will, and that he had hidden away his true intentions where only I would ever think to look. He spoke not of revenge, but of reclaiming my story, of finding the inner strength he knew I possessed. And he gave me a clue, a single cryptic phrase: "The truth is always where the love is stored." The final, heart-wrenching moment came as he smiled softly, his eyes full of tenderness, and simply said, "Remember our first date, my love. The stars were out that night. That's where you'll find it." It was a message that only I could understand, a final act of love that transcended time and death. I spent the next 2 days replaying our first date in my mind, the countless tiny details of that magical evening at the planetarium, and it hit me. The stars weren't a metaphor for the night sky, but for his secret workshop, the one filled with his telescopes and maps of the constellations. I went there, my heart pounding, and found a loose tile under the old telescope stand. My fingers trembled as I pulled it up, revealing a small iron box inside, wrapped in a faded handkerchief embroidered with his initials. Was his real will, notarized and signed by our old friend and family doctor. There was also a detailed document outlining his offshore accounts and a letter explaining how to transfer them to my name with a simple click. I did just that, not seeking confrontation or a loud, messy fight, but silently, definitively. And with the simple act of a mouse click, I reclaimed everything that was mine. The direct result of my quiet, calculated action was a call from Sarah, her voice shrill with panic and confusion, asking me, "What did you do? The accounts are gone. They're all gone. This is impossible." The story broke quietly, but with devastating effect. A silent tsunami washing away the carefully constructed lies of Sarah and her law firm. My son, Daniel, called me, his voice broken and filled with a raw, desperate need for forgiveness. He had been manipulated and blackmailed, and the pain in his voice was real. I listened, not with anger, but with a quiet, profound sadness. I made it clear to him that while I had forgiven him, the trust that had been broken could not be mended immediately. The family foundation was recovered and placed under my care, as the true will had intended. But I didn't hold a press conference. I didn't gloat. I spent the evening alone in Richard's study, looking at the city lights and sipping tea. I was free of their manipulations, a silence that felt not like loneliness, but like peace. And I simply turned off my phone. The story of my victory was a quiet one, a personal triumph that would not be erased, but it was one that didn't need to be shouted from the rooftops. It was all about what I had recovered, not only the inheritance, but also my peace of mind, my inner strength, and the love that had defined my life. I left Robert's apartment with a quiet sense of triumph that felt foreign to me. For months, I'd been feeling small, vulnerable, and helpless, a widow adrift in a sea of legal jargon and family treachery. But now, holding the documents that proved Richard's foresight and my son-in-law's blatant manipulation, I felt a new kind of power. It wasn't loud or aggressive, it was the silent, solid strength of knowing the truth. The world outside looked different. The hurried pace of the city, the cold glass of the office buildings, all of it seemed less intimidating, less threatening. I walked without rushing, feeling the weight of the papers in my bag, a weight that was no longer a burden, but a shield. I decided not to go home right away. The house, full of memories of a life that felt a world away now, could wait instead. I went to a small cafe we used to frequent, a place with a worn-out leather sofa in the corner where Richard and I would sit for hours, talking about everything and nothing. I ordered a cup of black coffee, just the way he liked it, and sat there, allowing myself to process everything. The image of the homeless man with the kind eyes, the tear in my son's eye, the forced smile on Sarah's face, they all played out in my mind like scenes from a movie I hadn't wanted to watch. The pain of the betrayal was still there, but it was now laced with a bitter clarity. I wasn't just grieving for my husband. I was grieving for the family I thought I had. I pulled out the photograph the man had given me. It was so simple. A snapshot of two young lovers smiling into the sun, with the Colosseum in the background. We were so full of hope, so sure of our future. I wondered if Richard had looked at this very picture and knew, with a certainty that only a man who had built a life from nothing could possess, that his legacy would be threatened. He hadn't just protected his wealth, he had protected me from a world that had suddenly turned on me. I realize now that his last act wasn't just about money. It was a profound act of love, a final testament to our partnership and to the values we held dear. The phone rang, startling me from my thoughts. It was Daniel. His voice, when he spoke, was tight with tension. "Mom, where are you? We've been trying to reach you. Sarah is... Well, she's upset." I didn't say anything, just let his words hang in the air. "The news, the article, it's all over the internet. What did you do?" "Mom," he asked, his voice now a mixture of anger and confusion. I took a deep breath, my grip tightening on my coffee cup. "I simply told the truth, Daniel," I said, my voice as calm as a still lake, something that, it seems, has become a very rare commodity. His silence on the other end was more telling than any argument. It was the silence of a man who was finally seeing his own wife for who she truly was, a silence born of shock and a dawning realization. He stammered something about being manipulated, about Sarah's lies, about the pressure she had put him under. "She said it was for us. Mom, for our future. I never thought she would go so far." The pain in his voice was real, a raw, exposed nerve. But I had to be strong. I had to let him feel the full weight of his choices. I had forgiven him in my heart, but forgiveness didn't mean a free pass back into my life. The trust he had broken would take a long, long time to rebuild, if it ever could. "I have the real will, Daniel," I said, my voice unwavering. "And I have the list of the accounts. Your father protected me, and now I will protect his legacy. It's not about money, it's about his honor and our values." There was no more arguing, no more begging. He just whispered, "I'm so sorry, Mom." And the line went dead. I didn't call him back. I didn't have to. The quiet victory was mine. I spent the next few weeks working with a reporter and a new trustworthy legal team to officially transfer the assets and set up the foundation in Richard's name. It was a meticulous process, but every document I signed felt like another piece of my life being reclaimed. I had discovered that a significant portion of Richard's fortune had already been siphoned off into shell corporations under Sarah's name. But with the proof from Robert and the information Richard had left behind, we were able to track it all. The legal team promised me that Sarah and her associates would face serious consequences. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that they would. There was no sense of gloating, no feeling of revenge, only a deep, abiding peace. I had a clear conscience, a renewed sense of purpose, and the knowledge that I had honored my husband's final wishes. I used a portion of the funds to buy the small building where the homeless man I had met on that Tuesday morning used to sit. I had it converted into a shelter and a small clinic for the local community, a place where people could find a quiet moment of peace and dignity. I never saw the man again, but I often thought of him, a silent guardian angel who had appeared at the perfect moment. The story was over for the world, but for me, it was just beginning. I sold the big house, filled with too many ghosts, and bought a smaller, more intimate home on the outskirts of town. a place with a big garden where I could grow roses, just as my mother had. I spent my days working on the foundation, a tangible connection to the man I had loved. The foundation's work was quiet and unassuming, just like Richard, and it gave me a sense of purpose that went far beyond mere survival. The final act of my quiet rebellion came on a Tuesday morning, a date I would always remember. My phone rang with an unknown number. I answered it, and it was Daniel. He wanted to meet. He wanted to apologize in person, to tell me how much he had learned, how sorry he was for his foolishness. I listened to him, my heart feeling a mixture of love and sadness. I knew he was sincere, but the scars were still too fresh. "I forgive you, Daniel," I said softly, "but I'm a new woman now. The woman who was so easily hurt, so easily manipulated, is gone." I could hear his quiet sob on the other end of the line. I'm not the same person I was. I didn't tell him where I was living. I didn't tell him about the foundation. I didn't offer to mend the relationship. I simply wished him well and hung up the phone. As I sat on my new porch, a cup of tea in my hand, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky, I felt a complete peace I hadn't experienced in years. Not the peace of having everything I wanted, but the peace of knowing exactly who I was and what I was worth. Richard's love lived on in the security he had provided for me, in the values he had taught our son, in the beautiful life we had built together. My own journey had been a silent one, a personal triumph that didn't need to be shouted from the rooftops. I had walked away from the people who had tried to erase me, and in doing so, I had finally found myself. I was 62 years old, and I was just beginning the best chapter of my life. The thought would have seemed impossible 6 months ago, but now it felt like the most natural thing in the world. I was free.